of attendees coming in here now. Just give you a few seconds to get settled in. 12:45 start. Here we go. So good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. Great to see you here. Welcome to Insects, the Indicators and Agents of Global Change, question mark. That didn't sound like a question the way I delivered it, but it is indeed. This is the second event in a week of discussion regarding sustainability and climate change. We have 3 sustainability researchers joining us today. I'll let them introduce themselves shortly. But before passing proceedings off to our organizers, I just want to say a quick word about ForSpace. Concordia University's ForSpace is located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. We are a physical space whereby we collaborate with our community to make research initiatives and course activities publicly accessible through any number of interactive and engaging experiences. So we're super pleased to be part of this week of conversations here today. We are recording and live streaming at CU ForSpace on Facebook, so I'll put those links in the chat in a minute. You're more than welcome to share those streams on your own channels. You're also more than welcome to join in the conversation today. We will have 3 brief presentations, and then we can take very quick points of clarification, kind of questions after each. And afterwards, we'll open up the conversation to a kind of panel discussion and a Q&A, sorry, moderated by Rebecca Titler. So if you have questions, please pop them into the chat. That's probably the easiest if you're a texter, or the Q&A box proper. That would be great. Or if you feel so inclined, you are welcome to raise your little virtual hand and we can unmute you so you can ask your question with voice. On that note, I'm passing things over to Rebecca. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center and the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability, I'd like to start by thanking Anna and Doug and the whole team at ForSpace for hosting us today. And also start with an acknowledgement that we are coming live from today from Tiohtià:ke, as Anna said, which is otherwise known as Montreal. This is unceded land of the Kanankahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Tiohtià:ke means where the 2 part ways, and this is a reference to the 2 communities of Kaaknawake and Kanesatake that are still strong to this day in the area, despite genocidal actions by settlers here and globally carried out against Indigenous peoples. So we recognize the resiliency of these peoples and are grateful for their generosity. Tiohtià:ke remains a place for those of many nations and viewpoints to meet, and that is a little bit the point of this week's series of events on sustainability and the climate crisis, which is a cross-disciplinary conversation. So with that, I would like to briefly introduce our 3 speakers today. We will begin with Emma Despland, who is a professor in the Department of Biology here at Concordia University. She will talk about some of her work on insects. Javier Ibarra-Isassi will then follow her. Javier is doing a PhD under the supervision of Jean-Philippe Lassard here in biology as well. And then Pamela Yataco will present some of her MSc research, where she is working again here at Concordia under the supervision of Professor Emma Despland. So with that, Emma, I invite you to take the stage.
Thank you. Okay, so people might have noticed that there have been relatively large number of insect outbreaks that have been hitting the news. So in Eastern Canada, it's mostly been the forest tent caterpillar. We've got in Western Canada, it's been more the mountain pine beetle. And in this case, the link with climate change is pretty strong. And then internationally, there's also been large locust outbreaks in East Africa. And so what I want to look at today is some of the relationships that these events have got with climate change. I'll do that through a series of examples. Okay, so the first example I want to look at is the spruce beetle, which really was, spruce beetle outbreaks in the 1990s was really, I think, the first indication that an outbreak was happening that was different. And it was different because of a warmer climate. Now, the spruce beetle is an insect that's native to Alaska, so it's always been there. And what it does is that the adult lays the eggs underneath the bark of the tree, and then the developing larvae eat the soft underlayer of the bark. So it causes damage like this on individual trees. But traditionally what has happened is they'd only been able to attack trees that were already weak or dying in a bad state So you'd get a situation like this, where most of the forest was still green and you had a few individual trees like this one here that were killed by the spruce beetle. What happened in the 1990s is that you got scenes like this where entire forests were being destroyed by spruce beetles. And this, of course, was very concerning to forest scientists, and they worked out that essentially this was happening because the climate was warmer. And so when you had 3 warm years in a row, you got explosions of beetle populations. And so you did have this devastating outbreak, lasted about 10 years. It eventually collapsed around sort of the year 2000 because all of the mature spruce trees were dead. And so what had been a spruce-dominated forest got changed into a mostly birch and poplar, so hardwoods-dominated forest with young spruce trees growing underneath. We then fast forward about 15 years. Now those young spruce trees have gotten big, so they become big enough to be susceptible to the beetle. And as soon as you got those 3 warm years in a row, this happened in 2016, you got another outbreak. But if you compare these 2 outbreaks, this was the 1990s outbreaks. It was mostly on the Kenai Peninsula here and a little bit on the mainland. The 2016 outbreak touched some of those same areas, but also moved farther north. And so this is suggesting 2 things. One, that maybe this region's spruce forest is no longer adapted to the climate they have now, because as soon as you get these 3 warm years in a row and you have a mature spruce forest, boom, the mature forest, spruce forest is gone. But also that if this is moving farther north, the climate is getting warmer and warmer. Okay, if we move a little closer to home, the mountain pine beetle is maybe familiar to some people. I think it's familiar to pretty much everybody in British Columbia and Alberta. So this again it's another bark beetle. So these are the adults, and here too, the adult lays the eggs on the bark of the tree. Those eggs then develop into larvae. You've got an adult here and a larva here. These are the larva and the adult in situ, so that larva is feeding on the underlayer of bark of that tree. And then, of course, if all the bark gets cut all the way around the trunk, the tree will die. So this too, it's a native insect. It's always been present in forests of northern British Columbia, but it's always been present at relatively low levels. And healthy trees have usually been able to fight them off. So trees can fight off bark beetles like this. They can actually pitch out the beetle. So you've got a drowning beetle here, and all this is resin that is being pitched out or extruded from the bark of the tree. The tree's defending itself. It's drowned this beetle. So traditionally, mountain pine beetle has only affected trees that were already stressed or dying for some reason. What you got happening now is, again, the populations are much, much larger than they ever were before. This tree, every one of these little pale dots is pitching out happening. So each one of these pale dots is a beetle that has affected this tree. The tree has been defending itself and pitching them out, but eventually it's going to be too much for that, and this tree is probably going to die. And so what you saw increasingly happening in the lodgepole pine forest in the Rockies was landscapes like this, where you had huge numbers of trees dying because of mountain pine beetle. And in this case, it seems to have been linked to warming of winter temperatures, that winters are no longer cold enough to kill large numbers of these beetles, so they all survive and the populations get bigger and bigger. Okay, if we look at what this looks like on a map, the regions in yellow here are where the forests were destroyed by the mountain pine beetle between 2002 and 2006. Beetle hasn't come back because of most of the trees that could have been susceptible are dead. And then it's moved farther north. It's also moved up the Rockies, across the Rockies, and now attacking lodgepole pines in Alberta. So this, of course, is raising questions as to whether lodgepole pine is now the forest type that's suitable for this ecosystem, or maybe this ecosystem is now going to change into something else because the mountain pine beetle is certainly having a level of effect that it didn't have previously. If we move farther afield, the desert locust. So this is the locust mentioned in the Bible. So it's also a native species to North Africa and Middle East, to those desert regions. Outbreaks happen every now and then, and this is normal part of how that ecosystem functions. As I said, it's recorded, for thousands of years. But there has been an locust outbreak recently that has been, again, different. And so this started in 2018. linked basically to these two cyclones here that made unusually heavy levels of rainfall occurring here in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, this is linked to the fact that warming sea temperatures means more dramatic hurricanes and cyclones. I think we know this in the North Atlantic, that the hurricane seasons now that start in the Caribbean and move north to the United States and sometimes all the way up to us, those hurricanes are stronger and more severe and more frequent. Same thing happens in other oceans, except they get called cyclones instead of hurricanes. You had these extremely strong storms that made landfall here. Large, heavy storms making landfall means huge amounts of rainfall. You might think huge amounts of rainfall in the desert is a good thing, but it's also a good thing for locusts. So locusts were able to breed in this vegetation. And because it's not, a cold climate like we can have here, you can have multiple generations per year. So a locust can go from egg to sexually mature adult in about 2 months. And what often happens is that after 2 months, because this is a very dry desert kind of climate, quite often all the vegetation is gone, it's dried out, and so those adults have to migrate and go elsewhere and try to find vegetation elsewhere. What happened in 2018 is there had been so much rain that when those eggs that were laid became adults, it was still green. So they laid their eggs. And when those eggs became adults, it was still green. So you got a third generation. And 3 generations growing here. And each female can lay several hundred eggs. So even if most of them get destroyed by predators, that still means, a huge rate of population growth. So populations here basically exploded. After 3 generations, the vegetation was gone. So then they migrated westward here to the Horn of Africa. We have this happening here. And then, I guess luckily for the locusts or unluckily for us, there was another dramatic ocean storm happening that meant huge amounts of rainfall occurring here in the Horn of Africa just when those locusts were moving in. So you get another mass breeding effect. And I think it's worth mentioning that departments of agriculture in these countries are not naive. So they know this happens and they usually have locust control programs. Unfortunately, Yemen, Somalia in 2018, 2019 were not really in a situation where they could afford to invest very much in locust control. So that didn't happen. Populations exploded with this additional rainfall. And then 2020, they then spread to multiple different neighboring countries. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that, environmentally, this is not so much of a problem in that desert vegetation is by nature very ephemeral, and they're adapted to, the above ground part of the vegetation is destroyed while they can survive, and when rain comes back, either from seeds or roots, they regrow. So it's not so much changing the ecosystem, but the problem part is that much of what these locusts feed on are crops. And so obviously, massive crop destruction is loss of income from farmers, loss of livelihood for farmers, and in some cases, food security. And so that really is the concern with locusts. Are these outbreaks going to become worse linked to these more severe ocean storms? We're not sure, but that's maybe where we're going. Okay, so there seems to be a sort of pattern here of outbreaks becoming worse as the climate changes. This has been studied. And here are some of those generalizations that seem to be able to come out of these examples. So one is the idea of this eruptive threshold. And once that threshold is surpassed, the initial eliciting factors, like particularly warm or dry conditions, or in the case of locusts, particularly high rainfall, might not be needed to sustain the outbreak. So for instance, the spruce beetle and the mountain pine beetle outbreaks were released, or they were begun by unusually warm conditions. But the years in which the tree mortality was highest were often kind of normal years. And so this means that the climate signal is difficult to read. It doesn't mean it's not there, it means it's harder to detect. I have a final example here that's closer to home, which is the spruce budworm. So this is a moth. This is the adult. This is another picture of an adult. The life cycle stage that actually causes a problem is the larva, the caterpillar. So there's one here. There's one here feeding on what it feeds on, spruce buds. And then this is a pupa. So the spruce budworm, again, is a native insect to Eastern Canada. It's always been here. There was another major outbreak in the 1970s. Some people might remember. We have an outbreak that started about 10 years ago. And Quebec does keep track of defoliation. So basically, these are people who drive around with trucks and they look at the trees and see how much dead foliage is on the trees. This is the status in 2013. So everywhere is red is severe defoliation. 2014, spread. 2018, so there you've got huge spread northwards, almost to the Manicouagan here, and southwards through most of Gaspésie. It's worth mentioning that by this point, much of the light defoliation areas around Baie-Comeau here, they're light because most of the trees are already dead, so there's nothing left to defoliate. And now finally 2020, so we've got, massive northward spread and the beginning of a second focus here in Abitibi. And what's a particular concern is the spread farther north. So the previous outbreak that we know about was in the 1970s, was in New Brunswick in Cape Breton. So that's, much farther south. Spruce budworm seems to be moving north. And as it's moving north, it's moving into the more boreal black spruce stands. And so there's concern as to what will happen to these black spruce stands under heavy spruce budworm defoliation. So people have model this to try and plan out scenarios of what do we think will happen to the black spruce forest. And this is because the black spruce forest is extremely economically important. And there's 3 scenarios, which are A, B, and C here. So we'll start with B. And B is the kind of things go on as usual. So B scenario means that, okay, individual black spruce trees die, whether it's because of, spruce budworm or flooding or heat or fire. But the forest grows back as black spruce. And so individuals die, but the forest stays the same. And so this here is in the zone here that gets called the resilient zone. So the black spruce forest is resilient, it continues being the same thing. If, however, you pass a threshold, so if you pass this threshold here, you move into A scenario, and this black spruce forest will become either a balsam fir forest or deciduous forest. Similarly, you pass this threshold here, you're moving to the C scenario, and the black spruce forest is changing to an open canopy heath. And whether we get, A or C depends on other factors like fire recurrence or ecosystem productivity, both of which also depend on climate. And so that's kind of the question that we have now for black spruce forests in Quebec. Are we going to stay with B scenario, which means it stays the same as it's always been, or are we looking at A or C where it shifts to something different? Just to give you visually what this looks like, this is what a black spruce forest looks like. And this is what covers much of the Boreal region in Quebec and supports a lot of our timber industry. A balsam fir forest looks like this. That might look pretty good, but from the industry perspective, balsam fir wood is really not very good quality. And then an open canopy shrub heath looks like that. Okay, so here too, if we look at it a bit from a bit of a more theoretical perspective, we're getting to the generalization that anthropogenic activities, so human activities, may lead to regime shifts where the frequency, the severity, the location, or the extent of eruptions or outbreaks exceed what we can infer from the history. So they occur when a system's resilience, and the resilience is the range of disturbance within which the system can retain the same function, structure, identity. And these shifts occur when resilience is exceeded. Now, maybe that's a lot of words. This is the same thing kind of graphically. So the idea here is if you look at my cursor here, the red dot, this is our system, this is our forest. And things change from year to year, so it oscillates. So maybe, 1 year you have a budworm outbreak, 1 year you have a flood, 1 year you have a very bad winter, maybe you have a fire. So that forest kind of changes, it goes from young trees to old trees, but it stays within regime 1. It stays within the resilient zone of being the same forest type. Then let's say you have climate forcing. And so you have a warmer climate, and when it goes here, the warmer climate pushes it to here. And then once it's here, it no longer falls back, it goes over that hump and drops into regime 2. And then it starts oscillating here. And so you've had a shift from regime 1 to regime 2, and your forest type has changed from what it's always been to something else. So if we look at the examples with the mountain pine beetle, we had lodgepole pine forest with climate forcing. Well, so climate forcing and the mountain pine beetle have changed lodgepole pine forest to something else. If we look at the spruce budworm, climate forcing with the spruce budworm is changing the black spruce forest possibly into something else, possibly into one of these open canopy shrubbery peats. So a couple things that are worthy of note about these regime shifts is that the triggers are often very slowly acting variables, things like globally rising temperatures. And so these very slowly acting variables are things you don't really notice because they're kind of hidden in the noise, but they do still give that additional shove to move the system from one regime to another. And then the theory suggests that once that shove has happened and you've falled over into a different regime, it's very, very difficult to restore the system to its original state. Another way of saying this is that we don't go back. Past is in the past. Now that maybe seems a little superficial, but we've got some more serious philosophers saying the same thing. And this is an idea that's called mutability. And mutability is that change happens and we have to live with change. And I think these people were talking about change more, changes that are lost. So, I mean, in Elsa's case, change was liberating. It isn't always. Sometimes change is lost. I think we know this particularly with the pandemic. We're not going to go back to a pre-COVID world. All the people who have died are not coming back. So where do we go from there? We do still need to move on, but we need to move on from where we are now and not regret where we were in the past. So what does this mean in terms of forests and insect outbreaks? I think one thing that's worth mentioning is if we look very far in the past, ecosystem changes happened before, just not in our lifetimes or anybody's lifetimes. So this is paleoecological reconstruction of forests around the Chicoutimi area, so northern Quebec, what is now black spruce forest. And this is reconstruction over the past 10,000 years. So that's really, since the last ice age. And here they've got a range of different kinds of indicators. So here I've put the trees, these are pollen from different trees, and I put the tree species names in English under the Latin ones. Charcoal is an indicator of fire, and this is spruce budworm wing scales. Now I'm incredibly impressed by anybody who can dig out moth wing scales from 8,000-year-old mud, but people apparently can do this, and that amazes me. But what it shows us is that, for instance, the fire frequency indicated by charcoal, fires have been more frequent recently, relatively recently, than they were, thousands of years ago. Composition of the forest in terms of trees has changed. So white pine, doesn't really grow around Chicoutimi now. 5,000 years ago, it was dominant. Black spruce, which is dominant now, wasn't that important years ago. It was there, but it wasn't dominant. Spruce budworm has been around, and there have been outbreaks over the past 10,000 years. So we can't say that outbreaks per se are new. Whether outbreaks happened in the Boreal and radically changed black spruce forests, we don't really know. But so what we're seeing now is unprecedented in historical times. It doesn't necessarily mean it's unprecedented in geological times. In practice, what does that mean for us? I think there's two concepts here, which are climate change. Really, it should be the other way around. It should be mitigation first and adaptation second. So mitigation is really reducing the causes of climate change. We know climate change is causing bad things, so let's try and slow it down. And this is something that is really for the collectivity. It's for society in general to address. Adaptation is recognizing that climate change is happening and that we need to change the way that we behave in order to live with that. In our case, we're talking about forest protection. And what this means is that if you're a forest manager, maybe recognize that what you learned 20 years ago is not true, because the forest that you have now is not the forest that your professors knew, and that you need to be more creative and more adaptable to manage the forest that we have now under the conditions we have now. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I'll remind the audience that we have time only for a couple of points of clarification after this talk, and then we will take more general questions at the end of the talks. So I do have a question from Carly Zeder. For your final example, how well are we able to predict whether we're close to these thresholds? For example, are there early warning signals that can tell us whether we may be approaching a regime shift? And even if we know it's coming, are there any management strategies we can use in the forest systems or is the shift inevitable? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely system dependent. So for example, the spruce budworm, the reason why there was that paper showing those 3 scenarios was an attempt to say, we think we might be getting close to a regime shift. If we are, here are the possible scenarios, and let's think about how we can adapt to that. But what's true for the spruce budworm, the mountain pine beetle is a different system. I'm not aware of any general answer to that.
Yeah, that would be too easy. Another question, any comments as to where we are at regarding the gypsy moths? Are we close to a shift?
Okay, what confuses, one thing that's worth mentioning is the European gypsy moth has been in Quebec and Eastern North America for about 40 years. It's kind of resurging, so it's a novel system. The Asian gypsy moth has not arrived in North America yet, and there's a lot of concern that it will get here at some point, but it's not there yet. So there's sometimes confusion when we say gypsy moth, do we mean the European one or the Asian one? I think the European one, there was concern that it would be completely destroying the forests in the 1980s, and then a pathogen got introduced and it kind of went down. It's kind of on its way back up, but I'm not aware of it being, close to shifting yet. And I think that's one thing that's hard with outbreaks is that, locally they're devastating, but maybe that's normal. So how do you tell between normal devastation and something new? Especially with things like the budworm, where the cycle is 40 years. So the last one was in the 70s. We know something about it. Some of those professionals are still around. The one before that was the 1930s. The one before that, we don't really know anything about. So we have like an N of 3, which is not a lot.
Right. Okay, I'm going to take one more question and then we'll move on to Javier. So a question from Jochen Jaeger. How many insect populations are declining due to climate change and chemical pollution? No, so some are increasing and others are declining.
Yeah, yes. So I think there tends to be a sort of, and I think the decline will be spoken to by the next speakers, but in general, we do kind of see a homogenization that the few species who do well are becoming, there's more and more of them, and then the broad diversity of species that maybe don't do so well under these new conditions, they're the ones who are declining. So we might have large numbers, but we probably have lower diversity.
Right. Thank you, Emma. I'll invite our audience to please hold on to your questions, or you can put them in the Q&A and save them for at the end of the presentations. But in the meantime, I'd like to invite Javier Ibarra-Isassi to speak to us about his PhD research. Thank you, Emma.
I'm trying to stop sharing, and I think somebody's got to do it for me.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Here we go. All right. Thank you, Dr. Despland, for such an interesting talk. Hello, everyone. I'm Javier. I'm a PhD student at Concordia, working under the supervision of Dr. Jean-Philippe Lessard from Concordia University and Dr. Tanya Handa from UQAM. Now it's my turn to tell you a little bit of what I've learned while studying the impacts of 2 contrasting agroecological management strategies across multiple biodiversity dimensions. So coffee, we all know what it smells like, right? Most of us know how it looks like, and some of us know how it tastes like. And actually, some of us need it a little bit more than we would like to admit. But coffee is actually a really big deal. Next to oil, it's the second most commonly traded product in the world. In fact, Canada is one of the largest importers of coffee, accounting for around 4% of total coffee imports in 2019. So all of these coffee means big business for coffee growing countries like Colombia. And in fact, around 15% of the coffee consumed in Canada is imported from Colombia. But what is the impact of coffee production on biodiversity? So first, we need to know that coffee can only grow in tropical regions, where we can find some of the most biodiverse habitats. And additionally, it is estimated that the yearly increase of coffee land reaches about 1,000 square kilometers, which may not sound like much, but it's actually about the size of the city of Rome, or roughly the size of the island of Montreal. And this actually points at a critical issue that needs to be addressed, the habitat destruction and its associated loss of biodiversity through the forest conversion to coffee plantations. So coffee bushes naturally grow in the forest floor under the shade of tall trees. And farmers who follow traditional practices try to mimic this environment by planting coffee bushes interspersed with other trees that provide shade to coffee plants, including fruits and vegetables that farmers often can use to supplement their incomes. However, due to an ever-increasing demand for coffee, traditional agricultural practices are giving place to more intensive practices. While traditional agricultural practices simulate the natural conditions where coffee bushes grow, intense practices do not use accompanying trees, leaving bushes to grow under the full sun, providing an increased yield of coffee, but of lower quality. Also, intensive practices create different environmental conditions and have been shown to be a major driver of biodiversity and ecosystem service loss when compared to traditional practices. And this is due to this strategy of intensive practices, mainly focusing on the coffee bushes themselves and not other potentially important accompanying taxa, such as, for example, ants. And actually, ants have been demonstrated to play important roles in coffee plantations and provide important ecosystem services. So, for example, ants can act as biological control pests because they eat the adults of one of the most harmful pests to coffee crops, the beetle known as the coffee berry borer. So this fact can also trickle down in to the improvement of yield in coffee farms. And now, given that different management practices change environmental conditions of the farms, there's a natural question that arises. And that is, how do coffee management practices affect the ant community composition? And we hypothesize that the ant communities in plantations that use the shade trees to grow coffee have a different composition from plantations that grow coffee under the full sun. But wait, what is species composition and what does it mean to have a different composition? And first, picture 3 sites, A, B, and C, with 2 species each. And which species are in each site is the composition of the community at each site. So when we compare sites A and B, we see that they have 1 species in common, or that they, in other words, we can say that they also differ in 1 species. On the other hand, if we compare sites B and C, they also share 1 species. But now when we examine A and C, we see that they are 100% different, that they share no species at all. And so we can evaluate how different variables can affect these composition differences. And after this brief intermission, let's get back to assessing the effect of coffee management practices. All right, so to answer our question of how do coffee management practices affect ant community composition, we sampled ant communities in Southwest Colombia. And so to contrast the management practices, we sampled ants and several environmental variables like soil temperature and humidity in 8 shade-grown coffee plantations and 8 sun-grown coffee plantations that otherwise followed similar management styles. And to establish a comparison point to more natural communities, we sampled 8 forest patches in the nearby area. So to collect ants, we used 3 complementary sampling techniques that have been shown to capture most ant species present in a particular site. So we used 5 pitfall traps that were active for 48 hours, 5 1 square meter leaf litter wrinkler extractions, and 30 minutes of active search. So basically active looking for ants on plants, on the rocks, and the leaf litter, etc. And so we sampled twice, once in August 2015, and then once in December between December 2015 and January 2016 on each of the sites. And after processing our samples and identifying and counting all the ants that we collected, we had to visualize differences between each pair of sites based on how strong the differences are between them. So here, each point is a site, and the difference and the position of it in the plot is determined by how similar or dissimilar the relation they are in relation to other sites. And we can identify each plot per land use to make it easier to interpret using different shapes and or colors. And we can then test if these communities found in these plots are different using statistical tests that evaluates if species composition is equivalent between all land use types, meaning that we would expect to find the same species, same ant species composition regardless of the land use type. So we would see the pattern on the left when the species composition per land use is the same, and the pattern on the right when they are different. We also tested how homogeneous these communities are by examining the distance of each plot to the community composition average per land use type. And so if communities are homogeneous, then this means that in practice, it would mean that if we were to walk from one site to another in the same land use type, there's a high chance that we will find the same species composition. And so like before, we would see the pattern on the left when the species composition homogeneity within each land use type is the same, and the pattern on the right when they are different. And so to get a comprehensive idea of how these contrasting agroecological management strategies affect biodiversity, we examined the effect across multiple biodiversity dimensions. And the first one is the taxonomic dimension, or basically the identity of the species found in each site. We also evaluated in the functional phylogenetic dimension, which means we examined the evolutionary relationships among the species found in each site. And also the functional dimension, or basically the different potential responses and roles that species have in each site. Now, after getting our hands dirty and our brain wheels turning, here are the results of our analysis. And here you can see the visualization of the community composition differences across the three dimensions. And each plot is identified per land use type. You see green circles are forest patches, black triangles are shade-grown plantations, and yellow squares are sun-grown plantations. And so when we analyze the differences in species composition across all dimensions, we found that ant communities found in shade-grown coffee plantations are more similar to those found in forests than to those found in sun-grown coffee plantations. Also, when we analyzed how homogeneous they were, we found that the communities that occur in sun-grown coffee farms are more homogeneous than those found in shade-grown farms and or forests. In other words, remember that if homogeneity means that if we were to walk and sample ants from one sun-grown coffee farm to another sun-grown coffee farm, it is more likely that we will find the same ant species with the same evolutionary relationships and similar responses from roles that we would if we were to walk and sample ants from one forest to another forest, or from one shade-grown coffee farm to another shade-grown coffee farm. And to better understand what was driving these compositional differences, we analyzed how some environmental variables were different between the different land use types. And so after doing this, we found that shade-grown plantations share more environmental similarities with forest patches than with sun-grown plantations. So besides having trees providing shade to the forest floor, forest patches and shade-grown plantations have similarly deep and humid leaf litter relative to sun-grown plantations. Also, shade-grown plantations had higher crop density and the number of twigs in the leaf litter. These differences in the soil and management characteristics are the ones that are driving the compositional differences between the habitat types. And this actually corroborates the results found in previous studies in the region. Now, to conclude, our results suggest that the environmental changes used or caused by agricultural practices constrain not only the identity, but also the potential role in hypothetic evolutionary relationships of species. And this is evidenced by the fact that coffee farms, regardless of management practices, they harbor ant communities that are taxonomically, phylogenetically, and functionally different than those of forest patches. And also our environmental analysis allowed us to identify that shade-grown plantations maintain environmental conditions that are similar to forest patches, which would lessen the impact of habitat loss in coffee plantations. So farm managers should try to mimic these forest-like leaf litter conditions to help mitigate the loss across multiple biodiversity dimensions. And so maintaining or increasing leaf litter depth and twig number below the coffee bushes could be used as a strategy to conserve ant predation services, because these conditions can favor the persistence of specialized ant predators that could act as pest biocontrol agents. And finally, this practices would not only benefit ant diversity, but numerous additional benefits may come in directly from ant conservation-oriented practices. And with that, I would like to thank all of our collaborators and funding agencies that made this research possible. And a special mention to Don Tonio, who is the person who tirelessly works taking care of these coffee plantations and is very eager to learn and help during these types of studies. And of course, thank you for your attention. And I would just like to leave you with one key message that we learned from our study, that with the right agroecological management practices, we can help lessen negative impacts of habitat loss on biodiversity. And if you want to read more about this study, we recently published it in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And so finally, if you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email or contact me through Twitter. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Javier. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? Just quick points of clarification at this point. We do have a question from Carly, who says, great talk. I'm glad I buy shade-grown coffee. I have a question. Oh, I can save this one for the end. Sorry, I just got the second part of that question, so I'll save it for the end. Maybe it's a question that would be better asked to everybody. So if anybody has a question that would be just a point of clarification for Javier at this point. Yeah, and how much of the problem are the consequences just fine or really a concern? So the consequences of not having shade-grown coffee, how serious is this? I think that's what's meant by this question. Right.
So the right now it's definitely it's definitely a concern for sure, but it can become a real problem because we're seeing that communities or diversity in general, we're losing a lot of diversity. And what's important here is that we're seeing that we're not only losing like species, we're also losing a little bit of the evolutionary history that those species have, and also the potential roles that these species might have in these ecosystems. So it's very important that we keep monitoring these the biodiversity loss caused by intensive practices, and we potentially can start adapting or mitigating these loss by introducing or integrating these different biodiversity dimensions into the management strategies.
I'm sorry, I've been on mute. Thank you, Javier. I have another question from the audience, from Kim Gomery, who asks, beyond coffee plantations, what lessons can city dwellers and gardeners draw from the ant experiment?
That is an excellent question. And what we can do is definitely be aware of what type of coffee we consume, or what type of food we consume. If we are a bit more aware of this, we can buy things that come from sustainable sources. Or let's just take the coffee to make it more precise. If you buy coffee that is grown under the shade, you are promoting these more sustainable practices. And so that's something that we can learn from this. And if you're a gardener, there's something that we have a bad image about ants. And so if we find ants in our garden, we immediately think, oh, it's a pest, let's kill it, let's get rid of it. But no, ants actually have many different important roles in nature that we are still trying to learn more on how we can perhaps use them to better take care of our ecosystem. So maybe as a gardener, don't immediately consider ants as pests. Don't kill them because they might be working in your favor.
Great, thank you, Javier. There are more questions, but we do need to move along to make sure that Pamela has a chance to give her presentation as well, but we will take more questions at the end. And if you have a question that's typed into the Q&A, it will stay there until we have addressed it. In the meantime, Javier, if you feel like you can address any of those questions in writing, you can do so at your leisure. Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'll invite Pamela now to share your screen and share your presentation.
Yes, on it. All right, so I'll be presenting my thesis that's on insect herbivore diversity of white spruce plantations. So this is my master's thesis. I'm working with Emma Despland as a master's student, also working with Benoit Lafleur, who is from UCAT, is like a co-supervisor and being funded by the MFFP. So first of all, why is white spruce important? So white spruce is an important source of production of softwoods. So softwoods being used for sofas, for a lot of the production of materials for Canada, and it's also very important for the economy. It's 35% of the marketable timber, and there is a lot of 29% of the whole wood production is softwood lumber. So these trees are being affected negatively, as I think Emma mentioned. A lot of these pest insects, outbreaking insects, that can come in. So in the region that I'm studying, Abitibi, there is a probability that the spruce budworm that was mentioned would infect this area, and it's been affected before. So right now, what can we do to manage these plantations in the future with the climate change kind of happening over time? So one of the major concern is of course invasive species, because warming of the environment can cause a change in the range in which species can occur, especially non-native ones. Here we see kind of a spread of the non-native species currently right now. So if warming would actually cause a lot of these to kind of move more towards the north. So we were wondering, okay, so we know that this can be a danger. How will climate change also affect native species? Because these guys, kind of an example of the native species of the whites, Canada. We know that already that spruce budworms being affected by climate change, occurring more of these unstable outbreaks. We don't know what's happening, but we'd like to know, would this affect other native species that might maybe not be so obvious to us, that could possibly be a threat? So that was my job. So why we are doing this is because there are studies that show that for example, some groups of Lepidopteran, Noctuidae, can do better in warmer climates and will reproduce more. And also warming of the northern region can weaken the trees and cause higher levels of defoliation and and damage from other insects. So because of this, we'd want to know like which species are going to be the ones like affecting this in the future. So my project, we went out into Abitibi, the Furled Station, to sample plantations, which are like this. They're just pure white spruce. They're kind of short, we sampled shorter trees around 3 meters. They have a very open canopy, lots of sun exposure. So although it might not be completely like maybe a predictor of how like an insect will do also in warm environments, it's higher temperatures and sun exposure is a factor that affects the populations there. And we also sampled those wild trees, like this example here, that are in mixed wood forest. And these grow a bit slower in mixed wood forest, so the age might not be exactly the same, but we sampled around the same height. I chose 10 trees from each, got 1 branch, and from there sampled herbivore diversity and defoliation levels within like the branch. So we got the percentage of defoliation and like the different damages that we found as well. So this is kind of an example of a needle miner, and this is an example of like a measure of the canopy openness that we did in these 2 areas. So measure also other environmental factors such as canopy openness, humidity of the soil, and so on. From this like kind of population data that we got, we went on to do some analysis, and this is a bit complicated. I tried to simplify the concept of kind of removing this environmental factors from the diversity data by kind of this Venn diagram. So when you have like diversity, like a diversity data set, for one treatment, let's say like forest, it'll give you, I think also as Javier mentioned, a point here within statistical space, and it kind of shows you how different each site is from one another, so you can kind of get the correlation. So we kind of tried to remove canopy openness. Soil humidity didn't really affect it in the end, so even though we tried to remove it, it didn't really change the dispersion. And in the end, this is what we got for only herbivore diversity. So we saw that in plantations, which are in blue, it's like very, like, there's a lot of like, it varies a lot from forest site, sites. And this, with another analysis, was shown to be mostly driven by adulgids and aphids. Adulgids are the little creatures that kind of form that pineapple shape that I showed earlier in the screen. So from like, this is only for herbivore diversity. For total diversity, it was another result, and I can talk about it later. So we'll talk about the results. So for what, again, we got more aphids and adulgids within plantations, and less, actually more larvae within mixed wood forest. So what could this mean? This, as I kind of like mentioned before, could be due, because of different factors. So studies have shown that between like open areas and forest areas, there's lower fungal diseases in these open areas for aphids, which could be a reason why they're in higher abundance. And there is also, aphids are positively affected by heat. They tend to like have a better reproduction. They have several generations per year. So maybe that's also a reason why they are increasing in these locations. However, for the larvae, like there's studies showing that Geometridae are negatively affected, which is a group of larvae, are negatively affected by like higher like temperatures
Thank you so much, Pamela, for your wonderful presentation. Does anyone have any questions specifically for Pamela before we move on to more general questions that were left over from the last talks? Anybody? Okay, well, I have a question. Are you thinking of doing anything different this summer, or just repeating to get more samples?
Yeah, so yeah, I mentioned I'm gonna get samples from like predators and parasitoids. And yeah, I'm gonna, because I only managed to sample in like the late fall. I didn't get like the whole population early and late summer. So I'll try to get that as well this year.
So you would expect to have greater diversity of species if you have a longer season?
Gonna be different because depending on the year, depending on the month, you'll have different larvae emergence. So some of them emerge later on the year, or they're very like early in the year. They might be very small, and there's a lot of like more like budworms. Well, yeah, that sometimes will like take flight in June and July. We went like in July and August. So yeah, I think great diversity, hopefully. Right. And better to have something that isn't N of 1. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Good point. Okay, I do have a hand raised in the audience. Kim, do you want to, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes, yes, I did.
Okay. So go right ahead.
Thanks, Pamela. I think that's really intriguing. I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions, but I'm just curious about what is your hypothesis for if there's an increase in aphids in the plantation area, and yet no corresponding increase that you would expect of their predators like wasps. Is the wasp itself somehow a more fragile species that's unable to adapt to the plantation environment, or what's your theory about why there wouldn't be a corresponding increase in the predator insect populations to take care of that? Like there's an imbalance somewhere. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's possible that maybe like these wasps would be more color late correlate that with like their nesting areas, but they do like kind of disperse, so it would be surprising to not find them in these areas, since it's also kind of an anthropogenically disturbed location. Like again, they just might not like try like disperse there. But I know that, like, for example, and this is the case a lot in like cities or urban areas where there's less like parasitoids, but it would be surprising for me to see that in plantations, because in like if you're in a city, it's obviously it's a lot more fragmented, and plantations is just in open areas and they're not that super big. But yeah, we'll see. It would be very surprising.
Well, we'll have to listen to your next talk when you've done more sampling.
Just next year. Does anybody have any other questions specifically for Pamela? Otherwise, I'll move along. Okay, we did have a question left unanswered because we ran out of time at the end of Javier's talk, from Carly. She has a question about scaling results. With agriculture, we often think about land sparing versus land sharing at the landscape scale. And I guess you can explain that if you like. So we go into my professor mode. You can do that. Do we focus on intensive agriculture and thus sparing more space for biodiversity, meaning that we would have conservation areas, or implying that we would have conservation areas to counterbalance that intensive agriculture around these intensive fields? Or do we share the space like with shade grown coffee, where we aim for maintaining biodiversity within agricultural areas? At the field scale, your work is showing that the sharing is good for ant communities, but do you have any thoughts about whether your results would scale up? Great question, Carly. Is it feasible for all coffee plantations to be shade grown, in which case we might end up with the entire area in shade grown coffee plantations as opposed to some coffee plantations in some natural habitat?
Right. So this is absolutely a really great question. Like it's very important, because there are many things that you need to evaluate to be able to say this. Because yes, from the biodiversity point of view, it would seem that sharing, it's the way to go to kind of like mitigate this biodiversity loss and other things. But you need to look at this from the perspective of the farmers, because shade growing, it may take some more resources to do in some cases. And not only that, it takes longer to grow. Like the coffee can take a little bit longer, or rather the coffee berry, actually, you get a lot less yield. So there's a lot less production of coffee. So the income so you need to evaluate these, what type of trees you're going to use, in order to help them, because they see a more immediate reward from doing intensive practices. So it's something that, yes, from the biodiversity point of view, yes, sharing would be the way to go from at all scales. But then there are other aspects that might be important as well.
I just want to follow up with that. So are there species that only exist in the forest that aren't in the shade grown coffee plantations?
Yes,
so wouldn't you lose those species if you went for an entire landscape of sharing?
So the thing is that you will lose a lot less than doing intensive practices, right? So again, it's a matter of evaluating the livelihoods of people still during these management practices, and so we would need to evaluate, integrate these, biodiversity monitoring across multiple scales to see, to mitigate as much as we can without impacting the livelihoods of people as much. So it's a very complex thing.
Okay, thank you.
I can maybe add to that, just to say that this debate happens in lots of different contexts. So, I mean, Forestry Quebec, there's the same question of, do we go for small amounts of fast-growing plantations, or do we try and manage huge areas for maybe less wood production, but more biodiversity conservation? So it's a huge debate, and I think the answer probably is different for different systems. Like, I don't think you can do shade-grown tomatoes. So, in terms of agriculture, some crops you can, some crops you can't, and yeah,
Yeah.
Right.
But it's the same question as partial cutting versus clear cutting, which was my
Exactly.
master's thesis, right? And I concluded that clear cutting, that partial cutting didn't necessarily pay off because it required twice as many roads, and you would lose species of birds, in my case, from partial cuts that then you wouldn't have anywhere because you would have no untouched forest as a result of partial cutting everywhere. Anyways, that's my work. I have another question. What are some examples of mitigation for insect population control to prevent crossing the eruptive threshold? I think this one is more for you, Emma.
Wait, could you read that again? Sorry.
What are some examples of mitigation for insect population control to prevent crossing the eruptive threshold? So what should we be doing?
Yeah, so one question there, one big one has to do with forest composition and the extent to which trees you have on the landscape influences what insects you get. So for example, for the mountain pine beetle, one of the things that has been brought up is, okay, in the last, in our lifetimes, lodgepole pine has been the dominant tree. But lodgepole pine is also very economically valuable and it has been planted. If we had maybe planted different trees on the landscape, we would have had less mountain pine beetle. So the mix of forest composition is one big question. Of course, that's, if we're going to put that as a management practice, that's very slow. And then the other one is just direct control of basically using insecticides usually to kill insects and to hope to bring the outbreak under control. And that too is debatable because if you do it early, it might work. If you do it late, it's not going to work, and you're just going to be, poisoning the landscape and wasting your money for nothing.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I have another question from Jochen. What if those ants provide beneficial ecosystem services like pest control? Why would coffee farmers not want to grow coffee in the shade? How can they get to sufficient profits in the sunny areas? Do they use pesticides then? But that will have additional effects? No.
Right.
Yes.
So, so definitely, you're gonna lose these predatory ants that can help. In the sun-grown coffee, you definitely lose. That's one of the major portions of ants that you lose is the predatory ants. But the thing is that a lot of coffee farmers, they don't see ants as beneficial at all. So we first need to work on educating farmers that ants can be beneficial, and to show them that they can be beneficial, because they see them as pests, so they're gonna remove them anyways. And then in sun-grown coffees, you turn sufficient profits because you get more yield. It's a lower quality coffee. Like, some people can even taste the difference, and so it's something that you get that profit out of just the yield that you get from difference. And the pesticides, yes, you definitely use. Some people use more in intensive practices, way more pesticides to keep everything under control. So, yeah.
Thank you, Javier. We have gone over time already. Forespace has been very kind to host us for this long. We do have another panel starting at 2:30. We will host Damon Matthews, who will talk about the carbon budget. So that will be really interesting. And we also have later on today at 4:15, we have Anders Bjorn and Daniel Horan-Greenford, who will talk about capitalism and science-based targets. So that will be another interesting one. We have Yvette Perfecto coming on Thursday afternoon, who will revisit the question of coffee. And so I welcome you back to discuss more at that time. We have events all week, so do check out the schedule where you found this event. There are 4 events every day. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists for your great work, our audience for the wonderful conversation, and the Forespace for hosting us so generously and for all your help in putting this series together. And I invite you to come back in 2:30. So that's less than 45 minutes. Thank you, everyone. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. You said it all. So thank you all. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentations, and so glad to see so many questions came up. I just reposted the full schedule for the week into the chat for those of you who are interested. Still time to sign up for the daily events. So on that note, we'll let you go eat your lunches, I suppose, Emma, Javier, and Pamela. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca.